Welcome back. It's Monday night at Pine Island Research. It's going to be a fun show tonight, a little different than what some people are used to when you see this guest. And I will just start out right away by sharing probably the comment of the evening so far. Leon saying, ooh, two primates discussing their behaviors. Interesting. Okay, yeah, that's hopefully it'll be interesting. I also saw Paradoia Will Destroy You say, I heard Rick Dyer's going to be on tonight. And that is a little bit of confusing information out there. He's not going to be on this show. But I will tell you this. It is the 1 year anniversary of when he was on Nikki's show. And Steve Kulls was on there with her. And it was an intriguing, interesting, brutally honest, emotionally devastating for some people show. And have heard from Rick Dyer and spent some time talking to Steve about this. And there is going to be a part 2, and it's going to be happening very soon over on Nikki's channel. Excited to announce that. Nikki and Steve will be back on with Rick, and it is going to be an interesting show because there was a lot of questions that went unasked, and a lot of the answers that were given only provoked more questions in some cases, and it's going to be interesting. I'm excited to see it. I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to bring in the Squatch Detective Steve Kulls. Steve, how are you?
Very good, very good. Guten Abend, meinen Herren und Damen. So,
oh man. So some people are already asking, who's Rick Dyer? Anyways, that I know that a few people had heard there was talks about him coming back on Nikki's show. Had thought about, would it be good for a different audience to hear that, maybe rather than just doing the part 2 in the same footprint that it was done the first time. In the end, we've kind of come to the conclusion that not really knowing where a show like that goes, and knowing that Untold Radio being a monetized network that puts out to a lot of podcasters, podcast platforms, maybe Nikki's show is the better fit. And had it been done here, I would have had her host it with me and her do all the questions anyways, just because she has such a great historical reference to it, second only to Steve Kulls, who was an interesting, it's hard, I guess one of the ways I put it to Nikki, it's not like you ran within that timeline throughout that whole thing. That timeline kept skipping off of you, like when Boscardi called you in the middle of the night and said, I need you to draw up this contract quick. And you're like, what are you talking about? What it just kept bouncing into you, that whole thing. And so you did have an intimate knowledge of how that unfolded and the timeline of it. And you are probably the most capable person of holding a guest like that accountable to the truth.
Yep.
And so I look forward to that show unfolding over on Nikki's channel. That's going to be awesome. But we got you here tonight to talk about something different. I think when most people see you, they are preparing themselves to hear about the hoaxing, investigating, all of that. And we're going to talk about something a little bit different tonight.
Absolutely. What people don't understand is that despite all my, outspoken talk about hoaxers and their behaviors and Bigfoot witnesses and, some of the psychology behind what they go through, my first area of research actually was the behavior of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot.
Yeah.
That's where it all started. It started back. I want to say I started getting that idea back in 2008. And I said, let me look at primate behavior and see how it relates to the Bigfoot mystery. Do primates act the way a Bigfoot does and vice versa? Because, for all intents and purposes, Bigfoot's a primate, tracheal hands and feet, large brain, forward eyes, small ears, small snout. Um, it's very fascinating, the parallels.
Yeah. I know for months, me and Doug had talked at length about um, all the things that weren't working in research. And you see all these failures, so to speak, or at least efforts falling short of bringing forth evidence that we need to move the ball forward. We started trying to look at it from the angle of the perception of Bigfoot. I mean, you're Bigfoot. What would you say is your weakest angle? Probably your curiosity.
Absolutely.
I tend to be curious about things.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact that I want to remain elusive, and I choose to do that almost 100% of the time, there are times I'm intrigued and curious about things. And maybe that puts me in a vulnerable position now and then. And when you start thinking about it in that aspect, you have to start studying primate behavior and how do they react to things? What makes them curious? What makes them at ease rather than having all the walls up? And you start trying to come up with the ways to approach this that maybe are outside of the box a little bit,
Yep. And primate behavior is the perfect example. If you know how to understand their behaviors within their different types of habitats, you can basically increase the amount of recidivism of having them seen. I've spent months and months and months and months in the bush, out. I think the longest period of time I was out, prior to prior to coming back into civilization was about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. Yeah, and you smell like a pack of wild yetis when you come back, but yeah, and I have been in some remote places as well.
Yeah.
I like we were talking earlier about the Four Corners area up on the Lukachukai Mountains, which is right across the Chuskas. The Dalles of Oregon, places in Texas and Oklahoma and even in the Adirondacks. A lot of time out,
Yeah.
spending 3-4 days off for 4 days and then back in the woods for 3 or 4 days.
So Joe brings up an interesting point, and it plays right into the conversation because, to Joe's point, he says, but wouldn't you say more to the point that Bigfoot isn't just any primate, it's a hominid, Steve? We still argue about the origin of this creature, and without a definitive answer as to the origin or the evolution or even the de-evolution of how it became to exist in all these different niches across North America. Since we don't have those definitive answers, I think primate behavior is the starting point that makes the most sense,
Well, Joe, what Joe doesn't understand is that all primates have this common habitat. They have all these commonalities. Hominins, hey, guess what? A gorilla, a chimpanzee, an orangutan, the great apes are hominins too. So they are not necessarily they are not necessarily let's face it, if a chimpanzee was placed in the wilds of North America and they could survive out here, which they probably would be able to some extent.
In some areas they could, I think.
Yep. But then again, their adaptability. I mean, there's those monkeys in Japan that survive perfectly well in the frozen, in the frozen areas, and they find these hot springs to take a kind of relief. But we'll break down some of the things I've learned as we go on with the show. But what it basically starts with is that we have a lot of people that do Bigfoot research, but they don't do necessarily the book work before the research. where are your sightings? I mean, we have so many people going, oh, this is a great area. I'm going to go out there and check it out. Well, power to you, but that's like a needle in a haystack. What people need to do is research where the sightings are at and what the behavior exhibited in the sightings are at, or not necessarily even sightings. It could be just audibles. It could be rock throw, voracious rock throwing. It could be, aggressive displays where it's not really seen except maybe a quick shadow or two. Those are all behaviors that are worth noting and looking at. We tend to classify our Bigfoot sightings like UFOs. Like oh well, a close encounter of the first kind is where you see a UFO, where you see a UFO.
Well, it kind of started,
right.
BFRO's classification, Class A or Class B.
Class B.
Did you actually see it, or did you just hear it? Or
right. But to me, the more important factor is Class A or Class B or Class C, which are tracks. It's all important. And what happens is that type of classification system puts more emphasis on one over the other. And let's face it, that a roadside crossing, it may seem, oh wow, it was seen. That's a Class A. But you have a farmer who has found a trackway on his property over a period of 2 months, and it's called the Class C. That's not as important. The hell it isn't.
Yeah.
It's
not too unsimilar to Randy Harrington and Shane Carpenter out there on the 400. I mean, they found up till a few days ago, I had featured them on sharing their 8th trackway that they found that was over 100 steps long. They casted 14 to 16 prints out of it. And now I see on Facebook 2 days ago, they're showing photographs of a 9th trackway that they found now. And I know that it's hard for people to wrap their head around. It's like, man, how lucky would you have to be? I think this is a perfect storm of them having a property that when you look at the resources and all the things that make that property intriguing, maybe to a clan that is in that area, it's also that and the properties around it and the privacy of those properties around it, the river and the water and the undulation, the ridge tops, all these things that kind of create kind of a micro environment that is perfect to where there may be a clan of them existing there, maybe not habituating directly on the 400 property, but somewhere in that area.
I would tend not to use the term clan. Those were the Scots. The Scots had clans.
Yeah.
I tend to use groups, very similar to the way they talk about gorillas and orangs and, and let's face it, we don't have a clan of people. We have a group of people. We see a bunch of people.
I think what's misleading about it is a clan is once you're in it, right?
Well, not necessarily. I kind of look at it from the aspect of, once you're in it, you're in it. But the chimpanzees, they'll kick out males all the time.
Well, and that I was going to say, that's why maybe this isn't applicable to their property, because from what they've best gleaned from their data is that they had a pair of adults that had 2 juveniles, and over the 2 years, they had seen those tracks get a little bit bigger. And then they stopped seeing those juveniles of that size of tracks altogether. And all of a sudden they had tracks coming in that were 9 inches long, which was a younger set of juveniles than those ones. And they never saw that middle set size again.
And again, guess what that all falls in line with? Behavior of other primates.
Yeah.
Especially the higher primates.
Those juveniles will get old enough where they just are ran out and they have to find and establish their own territory at times.
Well, either that or they're trying to establish their own dominance.
Yeah.
And that's huge. Some of the very, very interesting things about one of the more interesting things was the fact that when that in all my research, there were some things that really made me laugh about primates. There was the fact that when Jane Goodall was trying to habituate the chimpanzees with apples, that the chimpanzees preferred the fermented apples, and they would let them sit there for a few days before they would start to partake in them. because they liked the buzz they were getting off the alcohol that built up in that fermentation process. So
Pat says, but there's millions of acres of that type of conditions. That's one of the things we're going to get in and talk about tonight is the remoteness of some areas. And we'll probably talk a little bit about in that conversation how we talk a little bit about Seth Breedlove and Alex Petikoff's new documentary that they released the first part of, where they are almost bewildered a little bit by the remoteness that they found themselves in there. And these are guys that have spent time in the Adirondacks, in Washington State, all over the Northeast, in Florida. And once they were there, they were like, whoa, I mean, not that there isn't remote areas in the lower 48, but, obviously there are degrees of remoteness, I suppose, if you were to measure it that way. A lot of it probably factors in with how inhospitable is it to try to traverse the terrain in that area, and as well as how heavily wooded or how heavily timbered there is. We were talking earlier about, there's remote areas in the New Mexico desert that aren't necessarily hard to traverse. They're just
remote.
And
you know what? And it's amazing too that, there's forests in New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado and Utah that, people don't think of. I mean, like I said, the Lukachu guys is a range across in the Truscas. And, I'm up there at 9,100 feet. I can look out and see 4 different states while I'm up there. And the amazing thing is that, I saw the biggest population of mule deer or any type of deer in my lifetime. There was probably about 100 of them out in the plain, just all bouncing around because mule deer hop. It's kind of funny.
Yeah.
And
they bunny hop.
Yeah, and there they all are, just horsing around, chasing one another, playing, and it was unbelievable. And there's wild sheep, and again there was a bear with some bear cub tracks we found. So that place is good as anything, and a history of sightings up that way. And we really got a story from one of the Navajo Rangers, which was really a fascinating story.
Well, I think one of the things that we have to consider with Pat's comment here is, but when he says, but there's millions of acres of that type of conditions, there likely isn't millions of this species out there. Nope. I mean, we could debate all day long about, is there 5,000 of them? Is there 15,000 of them? Is there 25,000? What kind of a population exists? When you look at all those square miles of remoteness, there aren't enough of them to fill all those spaces in, obviously. Otherwise, there'd be a lot more sightings than there are. But you are they're going to be somewhere. And, to say, well, did they just hit a honey hole? Did they just find the perfect storm there with that property? I don't know. But I can tell you this. For every property you're going to find them, you should find about 100 properties that size that don't have them. If we're going to justify that reasonable population estimate of what would there be, they shouldn't be every place that's wooded and there's a river and there's a hill,
It's very interesting that, I recently did a lecture series up at Chautauqua Lake, and Jeff Meldrum was there, and he actually had some statistical data that there's some correlation between bear population and Sasquatch population, and based upon that, he predicted that there was probably about 150 to 200 Sasquatch in New York State, which isn't a hell of a lot when you think about it.
No, it isn't a hell of a lot, but yet when you look at estimates, I mean, let's try to draw a bigger perspective of it. I've heard other people estimate how many would there be in North America, and those I've heard such a different range of numbers, but somewhere between 15 and 25,000 maybe is what some people would consider a reasonable estimate. I don't know how you justify that. I'm not in that type of a science, but
No.
I would say that if that was the case, let's just say there's 25,000 in North America. When you look at the remoteness of these areas in Canada and Alaska and Washington State, for there to be 200 or 300 in New York State, that's a pretty good chop off of that total count. I mean, considering New York is on its own surrounded by an awful lot of habitat too. I mean, you look at the northern White Mountains of New Hampshire and the mountains in Vermont and Pennsylvania and Ohio.
The Berkshires in Massachusetts. There's the Appalachians. There is a lot of areas. Pennsylvania, the Chestnut Ridge. A remote area.
I don't know how you would deem a number unreasonable as far as being too high or too low in an estimate. I don't know what threshold you'd use to arrive at. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people out there will just throw a number out there. So, well, I think there's that, but it's not based on any science. That's why I won't throw one out there.
I think that Meldrum's estimate of 200 to 300 in the state of New York, to me, sounds reasonable just for the fact that there aren't that many. And you look at how much remoteness actually is in the state of New York, it would justify why there aren't tons of sightings, but there are enough sightings that people are paying attention,
Now, Pat brings up a point. I noticed that he said no one ever talks about percentage population to us versus Bigfoot. I think it's even more important to look at the percentage of Bigfoot versus deer versus bear versus that, because those are the animals that everybody compares them to. Well, why don't you ever find a Bigfoot body? And stuff
there's
like
a parallel that's drawn, and it is down to a pretty exact science when you look at predators and big game prey. For instance, when they introduced the wolves into Wyoming and they started decimating the elk herds, and they weren't really, the wolf populations were increasing at a rate once they were introduced, that they weren't really employing depredation efforts to thin down the wolf populations. And then all of a sudden, ranchers were like, we can't even make a living. These wolves are running through our livestock left and right. So they employ depredation efforts, bring some of that population down. But, they try to do those studies and how many elk are out there. They're doing aerial counts. They're doing all that stuff. Then they measure control by harvest. How many tags are we going to issue? And then after that hunting season's over with, they survey all the hunters. How many tags were successfully filled? So we can estimate how much were harvested by man versus when we do that total population count in the spring, we can now say, well, any difference between last year's count minus what was harvested with tags hunting is now we're going to chalk up to depredation by wolves. I mean, they figure this stuff out to where they know exactly how many hunting tags to put out. There could be, if you knew how many Sasquatch are out there, you wouldn't need that kind of science, but you can kind of work it backwards, like you're saying. If deer herds start becoming depleted in areas and there aren't recorded instances of like blue tongue disease and things like that wiping them out in that area, something's killing them, something's eating them. And you know how many hunting tags you issued. If bear populations in that area aren't up over what they were the year before, something is killing those deer. And could you put an estimate on a Sasquatch population at that point? I don't think you could put an initial one out. If you knew how many were there, had an opportunity to figure out how many were there, you could probably track that from that point on. But I don't know how you would use that data to come up with that initial number, to be honest with you.
And Pat makes another great point too, that says 1% would be like 3.5 million Sasquatch in North America. And I don't think he's saying that there's 3.5 million Sasquatch in North America. I think he's saying that, the reason why they're so elusive, if you think of all of us, the percentage that they're really at is probably like 0.3% of what we are at, even lower than that, of course. That's the reason why they're so elusive. That's the reason why they're hard to find. That's the reason why there's not a body. That's the reason, that's all adds up into that equation. And I know C. Blanton said something about, I believe they eat their dead. Well, that is not a primate necessarily behavior. And there may be some exceptions to that rule occasionally, but for the most part, primates don't eat their dead. And, you have to stay within the science. And if a primate has this kind of behavior, you shouldn't expect anything too far out of the norm, with the exception of certain cultural differences. And that's the amazing thing is that, chimps, gorillas, and orangs all have their own type of culture. Certain groups learn different things. So
I know that what C. Blanton's speaking to is, the age-old question that's always asked: how come we never find a dead Sasquatch, right? It's interesting because primate behavior will show some similarities to humans in the fact that they tend to show reverence for each other. And that's something that I've touched on in the past, that if a group of Sasquatch were to exist, especially in some northern territories where there are apex predators that are a little bit different than what you run into down south, not singular threats, but packs of wolves. A pack of 30 wolves approaching a Sasquatch is way worse than one grizzly bear, is way worse than a mountain lion. That would be hard to defend from. And the importance of a group or a small niche of them surviving in an area, how they would have to depend on each other. Those that play the nurturing roles with the young, those that hunt, those that play the sentinel roles and are always the protectors and the lookout. They all have their place in that system of survivability. And if that's the case, and they are capable of thinking at a level, or maybe in some cases, in some applications, even surpassing the way we analyze things as humans, it could be that they show enough reverence for each other that when one of them dies, they bury them. That isn't a whole lot different than what we do.
But we bury our dead to preserve the bodies, to prevent them from being scavenged. If that was the case, we would be finding them. If you think about it, if you have an ancient,
what I'm getting at though is if they show reverence for each other, there may be a concern that they don't want the body decimated. They don't want it consumed by other animals. They don't want it found by humans. So maybe they stash it or bury it or do.
Let me predicate something. Primates have reverence for other types of primates. They do not have reverence for their own. For example, you never see man go to war with chimpanzees or go to war with gorillas or go to war, but man will be meanest to man. Man will show no deference to man. And that's been proven time and time again. How many genocides have we gone through? How many, mass killings and all that stuff. You don't have that, you'll see that primates like chimpanzees attacking chimpanzees, but rarely do you see chimpanzees that would attack a mountain gorilla or a gorilla or another primate, unless it's a cultural difference and they're doing that for a specific need like food source. So you have to consider that. There was studies done where a group of different species of macaques would walk through the territories of another species of macaque, and they would not attack one another. But what do? They display, they act out, they posture, they charge, but they don't attack. But if that was the same species of macaque, it would be macaque. It would be an all-out war.
Sure.
So that is the reason why you hear a lot of people think, are they dangerous? Well, any animal, any creature is dangerous, including man. You corner a man, they're just as dangerous as any wild animal out there.
Oh, absolutely. But, I tell people all the time, if I'm out in remote wilderness, the most dangerous threat to me is another person out there.
Right. So what you need to do is understand that, you have a lot of the stuff going out. Oh, missing 411. Is it Bigfoot? Is it Bigfoot? More than likely, it's not. A lot of the stuff has some logical but insane reasoning behind it, but it happens.
Yeah,
Um, and not saying that there's other phenomenon at play either, but
sure.
maybe one or two of them may very well could be, a Bigfoot attacking something out of whatever need it needs to have at the particular moment. But that is an anomaly, not one of the norms. So
Sure.
you got to kind of understand that. But as far as they're dead, the reason why we buried our dead was ritualistic.
Hmm.
It would, it would protect the bodies, and we commit, we came from the ground, we put it back on the ground,
Ashes to
and
ashes, dust to
dust to
dust, right?
dust. And the fact is if a Sasquatch would bury their dead, very simply, we'd be finding their bones, because as we build new developments, new cities, new something,
Hmm.
somebody somewhere would say, "Hey, what the hell is this? This is a big
Yeah.
skull. This is
Whereas
it's never happened."
an animal left on the forest floor within a fairly short period of time
Yep.
is
Boom.
wiped to nothing, including the bones. I mean, you just if it's not preserved or covered, it's not there for future reference to uncover.
Right.
If it's left laying on the forest floor, it has disappeared.
Right.
But
And that's not to say Texas Jack said there were two separate encounters. Now listen, it's not the norm. Get that through your people's mind. It doesn't necessarily matter. Oh, well, there was a couple instances here, so everything else is wrong. No, it's not the norm.
yeah, yeah,
It's just like a cannibal, a murderer who's a cannibal. That's not the norm.
yeah.
It's an
We were
exception to the
talking
rule, and
about
there
that
are
the other
exceptions to rules.
we were talking about that the other day. The idea. I think our conversation was that psychotic people, serial killers, they are incapable of showing empathy. But then you brought up the fact, well, look how many of them were married with families, right? I mean,
Right? Their
it's
empathy.
not the norm for that to be the case, but there are instances that it was, and so you can't take behavior and put it in a box and expect
No.
that everything mimics itself.
Everything fits, just because, we can't jump to that conclusion that, oh, well, just because there was a couple of outbreaks of fights between, perhaps the chimpanzees had a different, culturally learned that gorillas were their enemies.
Yeah.
That's not the norm. That's a cultural difference. And like I said before, you can have cultural differences.
Hmm.
That's why, that's why some people kill whales or club seals. It's a lot of people are like, oh, club a baby seal. That's flipping horrible.
Yeah.
You understand? That's not a cultural norm.
No.
That is an exception to that. But that doesn't mean because there's a group of people that want to club seals, we all want to club seals.
People would look at that type of behavior and say, "Why would you want to do that?"
Right.
And they try to analyze some
Well, you know what it is. They
psychological
have
explanation, and
their
it's
reasons.
just simple.
They have their reasons, just like the chimpanzees
The,
probably
the
have their reasons. Is, oh
the
well, we
reason
need the
there
food, we
might
need the
be
fat, we need the oil, we need
the reason there might be as simple as it because my great 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 grandfather did,
cultural.
and that's it.
Cultural is all.
There is
It's
really no
cultural, yeah.
further understanding as to why.
Right.
It's a ritual cultural thing.
And then they harvest whatever they harvest from these killings
Yeah.
and use that. Just like, there's some chimpanzees that will grab monkeys and eat them. Well, that's their food source. So like I said, there are exceptions, but the norm is that it doesn't normally happen. There is a rarity. It's not the norm. That's why
Yeah.
you look at TV, you see a gorilla poach, we all feel bad about it, where we have empathy towards other species of animals, and that, that's why the relevance. I mean, you have a stray dog wander into the yard, your first inclination is not to shoot and kill it. It's to get it out of the yard. Well, what do you think happens when a human encroaches a Bigfoot territory where they habitate? And this is one of the how a primate habitates. The very first level is territory. And guess what? They get very aggravated when you go into those territories. So how do you think a Sasquatch is going to act when a human encroaches that territory? They're going to shake trees. They're going to bluff charge. They're going to scream. They're going to vocalize very loud. You may get hit with infrasound. You may get rocks violently thrown at you. And that's why when you see a report of that nature, that's where, now we have a landmark type of behavior that is the biggest one on the list. It's the top one on the list. Ooh, that's where we need to be near, not necessarily in, but near. Because like you said earlier, that they have this weakness. It's called their curiosity. As primates, we are curious. We hear something go boom. We get up and we look while the dogs are hiding underneath the tables, right? And the cats scamper away. We are curious. So why do you think those Sasquatch are seen at the edge of the forest, watching the woman putting her laundry up, or watching children play in the yard, or watching the campfires? It's because of their curiosity.
Sure.
So.
And I think that when you can, instead of trying to employ the same tactics that are used over and over that aren't producing really that great of results in research, I think when you look at it and say, if I was to remove those parameters of history of what's been done and say, I'm willing to open my mind up and look at how could I leverage its curiosity. There's a lot of interesting ways that you could do that. And the purpose of doing it isn't necessarily to guarantee anything. You're not guaranteed to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. But when you leverage my curiosity, if I'm trying to be elusive and that's my goal, and that's what I do 24 hours a day, decade after decade, when you come into my area and I simply want you to leave, first I analyze what's going on. I'm peeking out behind a tree, checking it out. Now, if I peek out behind a tree and you're doing something different than the last 99 people that walked through this area, I might peek out a little bit longer and make myself vulnerable to where you catch me peeking out. It's just as simple as that. Trying to get that opportunity to, whether or not you're there trying to photograph, video, get audio captures, whatever. I think before it employs any type of tiered response system, when it wants you to leave an area, I used to think that it starts out by, simply breaking something or, stepping on a branch. It wants you to be freaked out a little bit. Maybe that'll get you to leave. If you don't, now maybe I'm going to make a louder noise and start creating a commotion. If you ignore that and don't leave, now maybe I'm going to do a vocalization. And I'm just going to keep ramping this up until I accomplish what I want, which is simply for you to leave. I mean, they've shown over and over that their intention isn't to just come out and hurt you. That's where they'd start. They wouldn't start with the lowest part of the tier. But I think it gets even lower than that. The lowest part, where they really start, is they try to understand what is here. When somebody knocks on your door, before you assume it's a threat or friendly, you try to figure out who is it, right? Or how many are there? What do they want?
Jeff, we got a real couple of good comments. Sasquatch, the next two, one by Sasquatch and one by Wizard Adirondacks and one by Squatch Talk Pat. Let's put, if you want to, I'll address both of those.
Which one? Sasquatch Wizard?
Let's do that one first.
Doesn't make sense, that one?
Yep, put that one
okay.
Up. It says, doesn't make sense why we don't encounter Sasquatch way more often unless the population is minimal. Why do the boys at the 400 have constant evidence? I would discover them if I went there. The reason why I would assume is because they have found an area very close to a territory. And when you find an area close to a territory, you have an increased amount of recidivism. When I first started this, it was because I was getting frustrated. Like, what are we doing wrong? I mean, why? I'll tell you why. Because there's a roadside crossing, and then every Bigfoot researcher within a 50, 100-mile range is at that spot trying to look for the Bigfoot by the roadside crossing and doing stakeouts and stuff like that. That's what we call the home range activity. It's just going from point A to point B.
Sure.
The amount of recidivism in that area is low. And home ranges are like the areas we go to every day in human terms. Like we may travel to the store, we may travel to the school or work or whatever, and that's just home range. We do that.
Yeah.
But where you find recidivism is in, core areas of that home range.
Sure.
Like my travel path going to work every day, that's my core area.
Sure.
But if I'm just out and I'm off, I may go left, I may go right, and let's face it, Sasquatches don't go to work and they find their food, willy-nilly at will in the forest. So they don't really have that type of setup to where they would travel to an area pretty regularly all the time, like going down this path,
Well,
unless they have a food source and it's near their territory.
Exactly.
And that's probably what's going on at the 400.
I use that analogy a lot when I'm guiding bow hunters or when I'm bow hunting in a new area. The first thing I do is I'm on Onyx on my app, and I'm trying to identify 3 things. I want to know in this particular area, what's the main food source? What is the most logical water source? And what is the most logical bedding area? Once you've identified A, B, and C, you start drawing travel corridors to get from A, B, and C and figuring out where's the high value target area to intercept these as they're moving throughout a 24-hour period. I'm not saying that Shane and Randy have done that with this property, but I can tell you one thing Shane and Randy didn't do with this property. They didn't go into it and start call blasting. They didn't start pounding on trees. They didn't start howling and trying to speak a language that they don't understand. They simply went in and said, let's keep looking and let's just keep sitting here and listening.
Now,
and that's what they've done. They've found tracks and they've recorded audio. They weren't trying to go in and do something beyond their understanding.
And let me guess, they were there
perceived as a threat.
And they weren't there they weren't there. And my guess is they weren't there by chance, that there had been some activity reported on that property.
Yeah.
And it piqued their interest to the type of behaviors that were being exhibited. So they went there to check it out, and boom. Now, it's really important to take the next comment down right after that one. It says, I don't read minds. I don't know why they do what they do, and no one can at this point. Well, that is taken. You see, now that is just generic there. Nobody's reading minds here. We're looking at scientific behavioral data from primates, and we're applying it to a Sasquatch and seeing if it matches.
Well, okay? And it's the scientific method. When you look at something and say, I want to try to understand this, you're coming up with a list of options that may be explain what you're looking at. Right. You need to discount the least likely option or the least likely 2 options. And then in the remaining 3 or 4, you need to look at and say, what is the most plausible? Which one makes the most sense? Because you have to start somewhere. You're not reading somebody's mind or making something up by starting somewhere. You're simply looking at something and employing that method and saying, what's the most plausible explanation for this? And you may be wrong.
Right.
One of the ones you discounted right away, you may have to come back to. But
what you have to understand is you're not reading their minds. You're looking at the behavior and analyzing, is this a territorial behavior? Is this a foci activity behavior? Or is this a home range behavior? Mm-hmm. When you encounter a Sasquatch that turns around and walks off, that's going to probably most likely going to be a home range activity or a foci activity behavior that was not that crucial. And I'll give you a good example. You go to a supermarket and a dog runs into the supermarket. What do? They don't kill the dog. They shoo it out. Or, or a person, let's just say another person walks into that supermarket. Everybody just goes about their business. Right. But if a person goes into a school that doesn't belong there, you get a totally different reaction. That's the difference between a foci activity. It can go either way depending on the activity. Now, the main areas I like to concentrate is the territory and the home range, because that foci is kind of up and down. But if you consistently are getting territorial behaviors, which is the more violent actions, and that doesn't necessarily mean throwing rocks, willy-nilly, but throwing aggressively, like it goes whizzing by your head, and you're getting the screams and you're getting, which people have encountered. if you follow that path and know, okay, well, this is an area where they're hanging out, because that's a territorial behavior, and that's proven by other primates.
Here, Randy's in the chat. He says, I've been out here at the 400 for 8 days. My strength is perseverance, nothing more. That, but listen, the point I was making earlier, and I want to say this as well, Randy's here, so he hears it. One of the reasons that I believe that they are being successful in finding these tracks, and not just finding one, but nurturing an area where they keep reoccurring over time, is they never really presented themselves as a threat. When they don't go in screaming and hollering and wood knocking and all that stuff, you're creating an atmosphere where a Sasquatch may feel comfortable exhibiting that curiosity that we talked about. You're sitting by a fire, you're not screaming, you're not hollering at me, you're not, I'm kind of intrigued to keep watching you a little bit longer.
Okay, so this is the last time I'm going to address this issue. Pat just said it would take hundreds of hours of documented observation. There has been of primates. And what's Sasquatch? A lizard? No, it's a primate. So there have been hundreds of hours of documented primate observations. And this is based on primate behavior. And there is a generality, because guess what? Bigfoot, it isn't a reptile. It's not a crustacean. It's a primate. So obviously they have to have something in common that is common to all primates. And that's plain and simple like that. That is science. And it's not junk science. Let me give you a great example. Okay. There was a very aggressive amount of sighting reports going on in one area back in the 2000s. I followed up on it. My team had eye shine. They had vocalizations recorded. I've had 2 sightings in that area. And then the area got flooded. And guess what happened? And I mean by flooded, by people, by tourists. Mm-hmm. Guess what happened? It dried up right after that. Mm-hmm. But for a period from 2010 to 2013, there was a lot of activity. People had all sorts of things going on in there. And my team, when we went out there, we were getting results. And myself, seeing 2 of them with my own eyes. Okay. So this isn't junk science. This does work. And I've helped other people to have, at least getting some minimal evidence by trying to help them and aid them in this methodology of saying, hey, listen, you might want to check this area or that area, because the behavior, like a home range behavior, here's another one where there's a home range behavior on a roadway where we start looking, you start mapping it out. Where would their territory be? Well, it's got to be, let's check this area out. It's a remote. There is a way in there. Let's get out there. And then me and Mike Ann, we go out there, we do a podcast live with it, and we hear a tree knock. And mind you, we were not call blasting. We were not tree knocking. Same thing. We were not provoking anything. And we get a tree knock and we have a rock thrown at us, so it was kind of angry. We were there, I think.
Randy comments that I don't knock or vocalize because I want them calm and curious, not sexually agitated or territorial because my actions. Exactly what I was speaking to. And this is the exact approach that we took with our research area last year. I don't want to go in there speaking languages that I don't understand, knocking on trees in sequences that I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me. If you want them to exhibit their vulnerability, to allow you an opportunity, whether it's to photograph, to collect DNA, whatever your goal is, you need them to be curious, and they have to be comfortable to express that curiosity. That isn't going to happen when you go in there with the 4-wheel drive and the light bar up and call blasting the Sierra side. You might get a response as they get ready to run and leave, but that doesn't advance the science. If we go out at 3 a.m, knock on a tree, and something knocks back, you didn't advance the science. You didn't do anything besides create a fun experience to tell people about at the bar.
And, Pat thinks I'm still talking about observed Bigfoot behavior. I'm talking about observed primate behavior of the chimps, of the macaques, of the gorillas, and of other primates, including us. And there's a commonality between all of them. And I would suggest, reading some material on that, and then you can understand and see that, you look at, how certain behavioral aspects of this mystery happen. And then
Yeah.
you'll understand a lot better. But if you're going to be closed-minded, it's not going to work for you.
It's like Amy Boo said. It's like Jane Goodall, she said, because she understood that you were talking about
Exactly.
the study of primate behavior. Now, let's just
Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, Dr. George Schaller. Read some of their works. It's pretty amazing. And it also gives you some insight how smart the primates are. God knows what a Sasquatch can do.
Well, and to be honest, to address the notion that, well, we don't really know what they are. Listen,
right? And these are not.
I think we know what they aren't. And if we're going to acknowledge and approach it as they're a flesh and blood creature that is real based on the number of reports and the number of encounters and the number of, the evidence that exists when it comes to tracks and things like that, you need to at least have I don't think it's hard to draw a good idea. You might not know exactly what they are, but you have an idea of what they exhibit over a certain amount of encounters. And when you start drawing the parameters and the parallels that run with primate behavior and the descriptions matching, that of known primates and the tendencies that match that of known primates.
And this is not like trying to compare a bonobo to a Bigfoot or a chimpanzee to a Bigfoot. This is comparing generalizations about primate behavior. And then applying that doesn't match, because you know what? You get something way out of the norm. Guess what? It's probably not a Sasquatch. It's maybe a misidentification. And that's what people have to understand too.
Yeah.
And Randy's spot on. You don't want to agitate them. You want to get their curiosity up, because guess what? There's been times especially the younger ones, get very playful, and they'll start chucking things into the camp, just kind of like not aggressively throwing it. But that's one thing I noticed too, is that, they will tend to toss things into a camp that's not occupied. And I think they're doing it to see if they can go around and kind of get a little closer to take a look at what, this campsite is. In 2011, I got a recording and we left the campsite, and I kept the recorder going in the campsite while we were gone. And we had something kind of, you can hear some rustle in the leaves, and then you just hear this, and that was it. Done. You hear this ruffling again, and it's gone. Like, what the hell was that? So, you have these things. I've sat in a camp completely quiet, not making a sound, and have a rock come tumbling into the campsite after the main crew goes out to down the road to take up positions. So I'm just sitting in the camp, and it's very dark. The fire wasn't even going very big, and just sitting there listening, and all of a sudden, and I have that rock. It's behind me on my shelf. That flew in, and it was basically, and Randy knows this. We talked about this years ago when he had the TV set up in the field one time, trying to get their curiosity going. And the one night he didn't have it going, something started throwing pebbles into the camp, and it kept hitting off his ATV. And that's their way of testing. And you go out and take a look around, and guess what? Okay, there's people there. I got to keep my distance.
Yeah.
And that's intelligence, and that's problem solving and forethought. And if you read Chimps of the Mojave by Jane Goodall, you'll see that, how the chimps have this abstract line of thinking, that they solve problems, without having to see it in front of them. They'll think about it while they're not in front of it, while it's not in front of them.
That's interesting. One of the things I wanted to talk about was, and this is getting away from the behavior a little bit, maybe getting back to the subject
That's
of
fine.
Remoteness, but Friday, Seth Breedlove and Alex Petikoff and their team released the first half of their documentary, and I watched it Saturday morning, and I've talked, almost everybody I've talked to in our community that I talk to regularly, I've asked, have you seen it? Almost everybody has seen it already. So, I mean,
Yep.
I think a lot of people in chat have probably seen it. They kind of left you on a cliffhanger where they ended part one.
And rightfully so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was well done.
Yeah.
I have next week on Monday night, we're going to have Seth Breedlove and Alex Petikoff is going to come on the show. And they're going to talk not just about the experience of filming the documentary and what they saw, maybe expand a little bit on the questions people have that maybe that you didn't see all of in the first part. But also we're going to talk to Seth a little bit about the challenges of filming in that type of environment and, you know, the simple things that are become extremely difficult. And I'm really excited to have that conversation with him. I think it'll be an awesome one. But you had an opportunity to see the first half of this documentary. What's the most intriguing thing maybe that you gleaned from it? I mean, what was there something that you found? You know, obviously the audio captures are remarkable. I thought some of them are
they're fascinating.
intriguing.
Some of them are very fascinating. You know, the one takeaway I love about it is that this is a real, honest documentary, which I love. You know, they're not saying everything is a Bigfoot. In fact, a lot of cases they're saying, well, that's a bear, and you see them working the problem, critically thinking it out. And I think for me, that's the most refreshing part of it. Like the first audios they call, you know, they go, whoa, 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 whoa. And then they realized, well, it's most likely a seal, you know, or a group of seals that are going through. And I thought that was so refreshing.
Yeah.
Because unlike, you know, TV series documentaries, they got to build stuff up and make stuff more than it is to keep the viewers watching from week to week to week to week. Whereas when you're doing just a straight out documentary, it's made for people who want to critically think, who want to learn. And I love it. You know, people, you know, especially people that are new can learn a lot from watching that on how to figure out and problem solve and interpret what's happening rather than just going to, hey, that's a Sasquatch.
They invoked
It's
the
got to be a Bigfoot.
process of elimination. They demonstrated that well. As a matter of fact,
or Bubble saying, you know, well, there's the same Squatch.
When they were playing that recording, that in that part of the show, that was the one recording where I thought it sounds so. It's very intriguing, the sound, and I get where it could have been confusing before, but it didn't sound. It didn't sound like something I would attribute to a large primate, you know. And
Sure.
I thought, man, I hope they aren't trying to stretch that this could be Sasquatch, because I don't know how you could conclude that from this. It was quite different than the long sustained howls that they had in you know, all the other recordings. And when they came back and said, we later determined that this was sea otters or possibly even a walrus, I thought to myself, wow, that was freaking awesome. I mean, I was so relieved that they were able to ground themselves and say, nah.
Right. And that's what we need to see more of that, you know. But, you know, network Hollywood, you know, and that's why I kind of like Small Town Monsters. They do their own work, and they you know, luckily they have found a niche that keeps the operation going and comfortably.
They've remained unenslaved to the network and the direction of
and not compromising to what Hollywood thinks.
Yeah,
John Q. Public wants to see.
They own and control. They have complete creative control over what they distribute, and that will not be. You know, and I'll be honest with you. They could have put what they just put out on Netflix or something, and they could have charged some money for it, and people would have paid.
You know, really, Jeff, you know what would really stoke me for a project to them is for them to hook up with Randy and do something about the 400.
I think that would be interesting.
That would be
as far as Breedlove and Small Town Monsters, you know, the production part of it. I think Alex would be interested in it too. But, you know, Alex was telling me that, and this is one of the things we'll talk about next Monday night, is that when they were filming this documentary up there at this property on the Kenai Peninsula, at the same time, Seth has been filming a documentary and that where he was interviewing a bunch of different indigenous tribes to that area about their history and about their encounters and whatnot. And from what I understand, that documentary is going to, I think Alex felt as if that documentary is probably going to be one of the biggest documentaries you've ever seen released in our community. So I'm intrigued to find out more about that too. But I think you're right. I think that I don't look at what Shane Carpenter and Randy Harrington have as far as that property. I don't think that, of course, I got to approach it cautiously optimistic like you do everything else, right? I'm really hoping that as Scott Nelson analyzes these audio recordings that are lengthy and seem to be comparable to the Sierra sounds, and he looks at phonetically dissecting them, that he finds similarities in the phonetics displayed in the Sierra sounds in these. I think that would be monumental to
I think
our community. It would be a concrete establishment that there is a mappable correlation in communication in two different areas collected at two different times. That I think that's pretty big deal. But as far as the property itself, yeah, I don't blame Pat for asking what he said. There are times I would look at something like that and say, what makes that so special, right? Like, how'd these guys get that lucky? How did
it's very.
If we're going to subscribe to the theory that somebody is going to come up with the evidence, you're always going to invoke those same questions, no matter who it is and no matter where they are.
Well, that's a good investigative question. Like, what makes that area so special?
Yeah,
it could be remoteness. It could be, hey, there's a water supply there that for whatever reason there may be a food supply. There could be a number of reasons. It could be, like I said, remoteness being number one. So you have to look at all of that from that aspect. But I saw in the comments some people I think we should look at ecology and see what where they would be and what kind of food source. But the problem is, and again with a primate, you never know what they're eating. They can be scavenging, they could be hunting, they could.
And it changes with regions, so
and that's been tried before. And that's why the behavioral aspect of it, of what we're looking for your aggressive accounts, knowing that in the primate spectrum, aggressive accounts equals territory. That's where you're going to find your recidivism. And for me, that's been a success package, but it's very hard and rare to find. So that's the only downside of that. So,
it'd be like trying to study whitetail behavior and growth when they feed on corn and soybeans from Kansas to North Dakota, and yet in Georgia and Alabama, they're eating acorns and they're 35% less in body mass. And yet genetically you map them out, they're the same species. So, I mean, it significant different representations of the same species that if you tried to study one and apply that data to all other regions, it wouldn't
correct.
Fit.
Correct.
And I think that's a good way to approach, and here's another thing. When they're in Florida and it's 120 degrees 10 months a year, and then finally it gets all the way down to 80 for a little while, right? That is a different region climate than what you would have in northern Saskatchewan or British Columbia, where it gets literally 30 below zero with 45-mile-an-hour wind for 5 months a year. The caloric intake and the anabolic rate and rate of burn that they would have to go through just to survive that climate is nothing comparable to what they would have to go through to survive in Texas or Arizona. It just isn't. And so it's just one of those deals where one shoebox doesn't have room for everything to fit in it here.
Agreed. And that's why the behavior aspect of it is very general. It's nothing like concrete. I'm not reading their minds, but the basic behaviors you have, how do they react to us, is tantamount,
Well, and
to
I think we need to abandon the idea that if we don't know everything about something, then we should employ nothing when it comes to efforts in
right,
figuring it out. I mean, that doesn't make sense. You've got to start somewhere.
right.
You'll always have to adjust where you're at in your efforts to research anything.
Yep.
But you have to start somewhere, and where you choose to start and those adjustments you make along the progress have to be based upon reason and data that you're looking at in your peripheral and not just what's in front of your nose.
Right.
And
I'll give you another great example of how this behavioral aspect works. Um, and this is one of my case studies that I've done, is that, in New York, of course, I can always go back to New York because, I'm here and I can always get the data rather quickly. Was Now, I know this isn't a territorial behavior, but, we have in Whitehall, New York, Bear Road and Carver's Falls Road. And um, back in the 70s, there was a big flat. People were seeing them all the time. Now, I don't think they live there, because there's a fair amount of houses. It's a farming community and a rural community,
mhm.
um, surrounded by a lot of wildlife and woodlands and water source. And there was a whole flap of activity from 74 to about 76, 77. And a lot of people didn't know, but at that time there was apple orchards on, and Bear Road sits north of Route 4, which is kind of the main thoroughfare into Whitehall from Vermont. And there was an apple orchard on the north side, and that's where Bear Road and all these other areas are. And there was an apple orchard there. Fast forward to 2006. That apple orchard that was sitting there on the north side of Route 4 is now gone. It's completely been converted to something else. There's a few apple trees there, but nothing to write home about. But guess what? There's an apple orchard on the south side of Route 4. And in from 2004 till about 2007, there was a flap of activity going on roadways and in residences on the south side of Route 4, just behind that apple orchard. So and obviously an apple orchard would be a feeding ground, or at least for our New York squatches. And that is indicative of a foci area. And there you have two foci areas where there's a food source that they're going to, and that there's activity on both sides during these specific times. And that's a great correlation. And that's how we need to look at things and think, why are they there? Well, there's the food source.
Sure.
And that's how you have to kind of analyze it. Is it 100%? No, of course not. I'm not reading their mind. I'm interpreting what they're doing.
Yeah.
And
I know
that's what you have to do.
I know a couple of researchers that do bear research in the Pine Island forest and all the way up to the border with Canada. And one of the things that they noticed was that there was what they would call micro migration. There were movements of 15, 20 miles. These bears would move and adjust to the resources. And
Sure.
they might be an area where the blueberries were plentiful and they eventually dry up, or the crop maybe wasn't as successful as it normally had been in other times. And so as that resource depleted, they'd adjust 20, 25 miles away where there were more blueberries, or there's raspberries there. There's wild raspberries there now. And these bears would make these adjustments all over
Sure.
the place. Now, if you can imagine, this was resource driven. Whatever a Sasquatch needs or feels comfortable needing to exist without needing to micro adjust to different areas, if those 2 or 3 or 4 crucial resources all existed in one area, would they stay there? Would there not be a reason to move? And perhaps maybe that's what Randy and Shane have stumbled upon here. It's just it may look forested. You may see the same hills you see in other areas. You may see the river there and say, this area isn't any different than others. But when you really start picking apart and micromanaging the resources that maybe a Sasquatch would prefer to exist, and I don't think we totally understand what those are. But what if they all existed in that one spot? And from 1,000 feet away, it looks the same as all the other spots to us.
Yep.
You know, there's just things that we would like to make the assumption of, well, why is that any different than here? There's probably definitive answers to that, and we just don't have a full understanding of them yet. But if we were to look at other animals and what causes them to make these micro adjustments within areas.
And that's another thing that came up in the primate research, was that primates do migrate when there is a climactic shift or a food source shift.
Mhm.
And you think about it, if you look at primates in the terms of, humans, us Homo sapiens, the Aboriginal Native Americans, had their winter homes and summer homes. So they migrated. And the funny thing is a pattern we've noticed consistently is that you have, if you look at a map, you have, on the west side, you have the Adirondacks of New York, and on the east side, you have the Green Mountains. Now, we know that about mid-December, the sightings in the Whitehall area, in the Adirondacks, drop off.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But they seem to peak up in Vermont after that. And guess what's in between the Adirondacks and the Green Mountains? Right in the middle of it is Vermont, Whitehall. And that is why I think we have so much activity, is because it's a natural thoroughfare between that forest and that forest. And there's a big difference, because the Adirondacks in the wintertime are, at least in the eastern Adirondacks, which is west of Whitehall. Well, they consist mainly of birch, oak, maple, and they drop their leaves. So there's little cover, little food source, but the Green Mountains have deciduous pine, and that provides some ground cover for snowfall. So it kind of makes a lot of sense. Plus, pine can also be a source of nutrient. Pine bark and pine needles can be a source of nutrients. So there is a very interesting dichotomy going there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also think that these adjustments that are necessary for any species to exist in an area based on resources and how resources change. There's times when salmon are running up a river, and for 9 months a year, they aren't. You know what I mean? That is an attraction why maybe something isn't leaving in an area because it's ran out of a resource. They're leaving an area because they sense it's the time of year that there is another area that has a resource that's even better than what's here.
Well, Pat did ask a real good question. How do they deal with Lake George? Because the part of the Adirondacks where the activity goes on is east of Lake George, so they don't even have to go near Lake George. They don't have to cross it. The Adirondacks actually surrounds Lake George.
Yeah. When we talk, like Matt down with Central Florida Bigfoot, Matt Larson, and he discusses a lot, he refers to as the corridor.
Yep.
Anytime a corridor would exist and something would utilize it, it's because there's a resource shift or a climate shift. And I don't think the climate is really detrimentally different in Florida than it is in Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee. You know what I mean? Yeah, there is a difference, but from a survivability factor, I don't know that it's that big of a deal. But there certainly would be resource changes as far as food sources and things like that. There's reasons why something travels from A to B. I doubt that Sasquatch just gets out and moves because it needs the exercise. You know what I mean?
Let me do this for you, just so people understand what I was talking about. Is there you go, Jeff. There you go. So the area is, if you zoom out a little bit, you have your Green Mountain Range, which runs right in here and in here, especially in here. And you have your Adirondacks. And the point I'm talking about, the Adirondacks, is the eastern side of Lake George, all up in here. There, this is where, you even see Adirondack Park there. This is the general area that I've had a lot of activity over the years. In this general area. And what it looks like is there is Whitehall right there. And there's Fairhaven. And there's been a fair amount of sightings in Fairhaven and Castleton, Vermont. And then you start getting into the Bird Mountain area. And then just beyond that is the Green Mountains. So, I mean, yeah. And you see all this activity that happens through Proctor, in through Putnam, Castleton, Fairhaven, and then into Whitehall. This is all the Whitehall proper area in here. And you look right in here is where Abear Road is. That's where that flap happened in the 70s. And then you go the other side of Route 4, where the other apple orchard is, and this is where the flap happened in the mid 2000s. And then you have here, which is sporadically over the last 30 years.
Donald says, Steve just had his arrow over the area of my experience.
There you go. There you go. So yeah. And I think it's a very hard way to get around that particular area to get into. But the funny thing is there has been, sightings around Ticonderoga. So it's possible that certain contingent may come in through the Ticonderoga area. It's very, as you can see, it's very well. You can actually get through these areas. But I haven't really studied the Essex County, which is north of Washington County. But yeah, and there's been sightings up in this whole area. There's been there's been a lot of reports, especially in this area, of hearing vocals. And it's unclear whether the vocals are coming from over here or over here. But yeah, it's quite a great area. And it's just, you think about it, there's all these sightings in Whitehall, which is right here. Where would they be, bedding down? Where would they be hiding out? And then you start looking, well, and it's just common sense. Okay, this would be a good area. And of course, this whole vast area over here would be wonderful. So, it doesn't take, you got to look at where your sightings are and then look for the most logical remote area that they would hang out in. And there's so many people out there, and I'm just really too old to be necessarily thinking about just willy-nilly, let's go here, let's go there. I want to find this thing. I want to find these some experiences. So you gotta put you gotta research where you want to go.
That's one of the reasons why I picked the area to research that I did last year. Was there were a high number of sightings in a little landmark called Debs, Minnesota, which is near Clearwater Lake, just south of the Red Lake Indian Reservation. And there were sightings in northern Itasca State Forest. And if you look at where this cluster of 5 sightings were in the Clearwater River, Debs, Minnesota area, and where I knew that there in the last 18 months, there was 3 or 4 pretty credible sightings in northern Itasca County, there was one stretch in between there, and the stretch was the length of the Clearwater River, connected the two. And that's where the idea of we're going to use the river to kayak and access these different clearings all along that stretch and start just employing that whole, let's see if we can get something moved out of curiosity measure until it eventually worked. I mean, it didn't happen the first time, didn't happen the second time. It took a while, but it wasn't just poking a pin on a map saying that looks like a pretty thick forest, let's go there. It was based on sightings that weren't over the last decade, that were over the last 18 months. And it was just simply saying, if there's a cluster here and there's a cluster here, and the only thing connecting them is one river that usually isn't traveled, and it's in an uninhabited area that doesn't get recreational use. It could simply be that there's just as many sightings that could have been reported in that blank area between those two clusters. It's just nobody goes there. Maybe that's even more comfortable for them to remain there than it is at A or B. They like to remain in between, you know. And so I think you're spot on when you talk about at least doing your research should always start with what is the record of recent encounters, let's say over the last 24 months in the target area that I'm looking at. And now let's see if I can pick out these high value target pinpoints that maybe don't see a lot of human traffic, that maybe hold an obvious resource. There's a creek there, or there's a lake there, you know, and you start at least, does that the answer of where they'll be? No, but you have to start somewhere, and you can't be afraid to just say, I'm going to start here. Not, well, this place is as good as any. That's a horrible technique.
Right. Yep. You gotta think outside the box sometimes.
Yeah.
And that was my way of thinking outside the box. Hey, you know what? This is how primates habitate. This is their behaviors in that. How does this apply to Bigfoot behavior? Do we see something similar? And we do. We absolutely do. So that really makes, to me, that was the most fascinating, you know, kicker. And then everything from the migration, primates can migrate if, things happen. So, and we knew that going into it, that, when I was working with my, mentor back in 2003 and 2005 and 2006, Bill Brand, we had saw that pattern consistently. Here sightings, they were just, it's like, yep. And this time of year, and then over here, this time of year. So it's got to be something transitional. And to me, what that tells me is we're looking at a real phenomenon.
Yeah.
And this is all before I had, my sightings. So, we're looking at a real phenomenon. The behaviors are consistent with other animals. Let's put it to the test. And I did. And it panned out in that particular area. There were sightings. There was, some were aggressive. So we knew an area that, they kind of didn't claim as their territory. And there had been sightings in that area too, but they were more like home range type of behaviors where they're coming out. Okay, it's not our territory. Oh, they see us. See you later. But some people that wandered into a particular area of that, east of Lake George area, west of Whitehall, were getting aggressive, behaviors from them. So that was telling me, hey, this all fits within the primate behavior mode. So this is where we need to be. But we try to be respectful of it. One of the things I try not to do is go into their territory because they're naturally curious. Let's get near their territory. Let's push the envelope a little bit. Let's get a little close, but not into it where this stuff is going on. And then let's do some stuff to kind of provoke their curiosity. Let's have a campfire. Let's have a good time in front of the campfire for a little while. See if they'll come out. Let's, and one of the things I always did too was when I got there, I used to just give a couple of, friendly whoops. If you think about how primates vocalize, there's curiosity vocals, which are usually whoops, which are curiosity. You see people in the woods going, oh, that's territorial. That's violent. That's, but a couple of whoops, that's a curiosity type of call.
Mm-hmm.
I may hit a tree a couple of times and I'm done. Okay. They know we're here. And guess what? It consistently from 2011 to 2011, 2012, when we did that, I'll give it about 45 minutes and then stuff would start happening without any provocation.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was I was up there so much in 2009, 2010, and that by 2011, when I did that, it kind of told them that, okay, it's that person again, because, primates can figure that out, that, okay, we hear this every time these people are here. and stuff would start happening. So you can get them familiar with you there, and see, and go from there.
Yeah.
And
I think that's one of the things that I saw in the way that I approached the research last year is that what made him curious wasn't necessarily the objects I was leaving. It was the fact that I was going through a lot of effort to access an area that they probably at first didn't want me to be there, right? And but yet my visits really invoked curiosity because I was never there for longer than an hour. I wasn't hunting, I wasn't killing anything. That's what they normally see when humans come into that area. I wasn't pitching a tent and camping and spending a significant amount of time there, like 24 hours, like backpackers would do or hikers would do when they're coming through that area. This dude just comes in and an hour later he's gone. It's like about the time he gets on my nerves, he's gone again. It's like I think it kind of did it leverage curiosity just in itself. Like, why does this guy only show up for an hour and he doesn't do anything that seems to be able for me to reason why he's here other than he plays with something and then leaves it, right?
Yep.
And I think it's just an example of that, of flexing and or leveraging that curiosity. But also, I also wanted to touch on something that you said. The reasons why a Sasquatch or a group of Sasquatch may leave an area and establish another area, sometimes it isn't resource driven. I think what Randy and Shane have over the course of discovering 8 to 9 trackways over a significant period of time, it's not a month, but it's a few years now, 4 years, that they're when they saw that set of adolescent or those juveniles get big enough that they disappeared and all of a sudden there was a younger set of juveniles there.
Yes,
they didn't disappear into thin air. That was a territory deal. They were told you're not welcome to be here anymore, and they had to establish themselves somewhere else. May have been 10 miles away, may have been 100 miles away. Who knows?
Well,
they had to go.
Well, the other instance is this. Let's assume, that a Sasquatch group is a smaller group than, per se, a chimpanzee group, which can be, you can get up in the upwards of, 30 members, 40 members. What if they're just family units? Not necessarily like, or smaller units. Say there's like 5 or 6 of them or 7 of them. That one gets to sexual maturity. It's not taking off because it was asked to leave. It's taking off because it wants to find a mate.
Sure.
And that's probably
you
the
see
number
that,
one.
You see that with
Right.
moose.
Yep.
I mean, deer, a doe will have 1 or 2 fawns, and 8 months later, when it comes to breeding time, they'll run them fawns off and get knocked up all over again and start the cycle. It's an annual deal. It's cyclic. Whereas moose, you'll see a bull moose with not big antlers, but fairly small antlers, because they'll stay with their mother. A cow will keep a young moose with them for 3 years before they run them off. And so a lot of times you'll see a moose that's got some decent antlers. They're not, they might not even be legal to shoot, but you see one that's 3 years old, it may still be hanging with its mother. It hasn't been ran off, and it may never be ran off. Its decision to leave may be because I want to go start my own family. I've reached that age where I want to go breed myself. And it has nothing to do with territory. It has to do with the natural wonderment of finding something different,
And chimpanzees go on walkabout almost every day.
Yeah.
They tend to do that. And the curiosity factor though is really good. Both sightings of mine were based on them trying to sneak a peek. In 2011, we had a big old campfire going. We had been out during the night. People were saying they were being paralleled down the road. I experienced that too, as well, not on just one side of the road, but on both sides of the road. You could hear something kind of paralleling, walking in the woods on both sides. I'm like, what the hell? I sent my son down there, who is a, fish and wildlife guy. And he came back and said, yeah, that's really weird. Something's following us on both sides, and followed us up and it followed us back. And then, at one point I go to get batteries out of my car, parked along a dirt road. And again, this is October. The leaves have fallen. And that's where the one was standing along the utility pole. And what it was doing was probably watching our campfire and watching us laughing and hooting and hollering. Remember, we're their television. That's the way I look at it, because primates need mental stimulation. That's why, like, hey, we're their TV. Look at this. Oh, look at these guys. And, eventually it walked off and everybody heard it. But the following year, which was even more interesting, was I just got out of my tent, and there's a 5.5 foot juvenile that just, boom, takes off. And my thoughts was like, nah, God, I must be really overtired. I don't know. Used my tree, got back in the tent. Had to use the tree a little later on that time. I stuck my head out and used the flashlight to see if anyone was out there. And I used the tree, went back. And the next morning, I wasn't going to say anything until, because I'm like, I don't know what the hell I saw. I'm sitting there saying, I know I saw it, but there is that level of trying to unconvince yourself.
Yeah.
And it turned out that Jeff starts yelling. One of the guys in the group, Jeff Thomas, something had left a birch limb or a birch piece behind his Jeep that wasn't there 11 o'clock the night previously. And the funny thing is all through the day we were collecting birch because it had been raining, and we needed the oil, and birch will burn regardless if it's wet or not. So that's where we were collecting, and something observed that and left in between 11 o'clock at night and 7 the next morning, left a birch thing. And
I'll show you a birch log. Check this out.
Yeah. And it wasn't very big. It was actually only probably about that big. It was pretty thick, but we had found where it had been pulled out of this mucky water area. Like, who the hell would have pulled that out of there? Nobody would have stepped in there. It's all wet. We were kind of avoiding that little area. It was in the gully alongside the other side of the dirt road. But something had gone in there overnight, went and put it behind the Jeep for whatever reason. Made no sense.
And it wasn't like the base of it was at a broken stump point. I mean, it was actually moved and deposited there. Because birch trees are interesting. I don't know how many people are real familiar. I don't know. Like, I find sometimes people are talking about trees that I don't even have in my area, right? But when it comes to birch trees, it's like birch trees have a really shallow root system. Birch trees are usually preferred by bears when they scratch their backs on them. They tend to use birch trees a lot. And the interesting thing about birch trees is because that shallow root system, it doesn't take much to push one over.
No.
You can find a birch tree that's 10 inches round, and even with human strength, push as hard as you can. A lot of times when it uproots, the root ball is only the size of an ice cream bucket. It's not huge for how big of a tree it is. And so they're not hard to knock down. They're not hard for wind to knock them down. A lot of times they're the first tree that's susceptible in a lot of areas where there's birch to being knocked down from wind. But when you see one completely moved and deposited someplace where it's not even anywhere close to where it would have originally been standing, it seems to me that's what, in my encounter, that's what it was holding, was about a 5 foot section of birch. And I have heard that in other encounters of whatever the significance is. Maybe it is just because they're easy to knock over. I mean, there might be something very real to that. If part of their tiered escalation system, when you come into their area and they don't want you there, and they're like, okay, I'm going to push a tree over, I'm going to make some noise. Why not use the easiest one to push over, right? Why would you go with one that's hard to push over? So, they just reach out with a hand like this and knock over a pretty good sized birch tree.
Well, I love it. It's a great survival tip too. If you're out in the woods and you need to start a fire, you get your kindling going. Birch you can peel off in little strips, and you get a little handful of those, and you light those on fire. It goes up like gasoline because of the oil in it, and you put that under your kindling, and before you know it, you have yourself a good sized fire.
Yep. No, and also when everything else is wet and saturated, you peel the birch bark off of a birch log, and typically it's not there is a sappy layer there that kind of protects it and keeps it from soaking up a lot of water. But like you said, the oils are so flammable in birch bark, even when it's wet, you can shred it and keep
Oh
just
yeah.
keep working it between two rocks till you've got it almost turns into like a sappy fluff
I've
that
I've
is
I've
like,
lit I've lit a fully damp piece of birch bark before without even having to do anything
yeah,
to it. You
it's
just put it
like you
the
squirted lighter fluid on. It's like,
what you
why
do
does
is
this
that
stuff
that
burn so good?
you light it and the oils inside that bark get superheated anyway, and they
Yeah.
I would
So
I would have no idea because primates have different home
I'm
ranges.
going to read this out just because those on listening on podcasts, maybe they don't see what we're displaying. So Sasquatch Wizard on Adirondack says, Jeff or Steve, based on primate behaviors, what is your best guess on a family of Sasquatch's home range? And I think, again,
It's too specific.
that is really going to play into what region that you're in, what area that you're in. If you're in these areas of Canada, northern Idaho, where you can literally start walking through pretty unhospitable terrain 20 miles and you still don't cross a fire road, that it wouldn't need a big range to exist. Whereas other areas where they have seasonal pressure, hunting seasons, things like that, they're going to need to adjust to those types of pressure, and those resources may be more limited in certain areas than others. I don't want to speak factually on this. I'm just saying common sense would lead you to believe that the size of the range would probably depend on, they need A, B, C, and D, and E, or however long that list is to exist. They need X amount of resources to exist. And if they can find all those resources in a smaller range, they might not have as big of a range. Whereas,
I really think that it's anybody's guess because that a specific range of a specific type of primate. Like I said, this is about generalities. Do they have a home range? Yes. What it is, no idea. I mean, the other thing you have to look at too, are there, fire cuts available? Are there railroad cuts available? I took a report in 2003 of a couple of kids seeing a Sasquatch, on a railroad cut. And, that's highway to them. They can get on there and go for miles.
yeah,
So, you just don't know. Same thing with, there was one up at the ski resort, which is now closed up in Vermont back in the 80s, where they actually saw four of them. And this whole family of people had seen four of them, skittering across down the hill a little bit and then into the woodline. Um, and these were all very credible, type of people
yeah,
that were
yeah,
witnessing these. And although they were reported in the case of the kids, I actually took that report. But the case of the ski resort, that was actually my mentor who took that report years ago.
yeah,
And he believed they were very credible. And Bill can be a very skeptical guy sometimes. So it's very fascinating stuff. But you just can't. It's too specific to the animal or the creature to say for sure what their home range would be.
sure. I mean, if you were to look at other species, a lot of that is really dependent on the immediate environment that they're in. I mean, I think that one of the things that I learned over the years from Billy Moles and other guides that guide brown bear and grizzly bear hunters up in Alaska, and Alex and Seth approach it in their documentary too, is the difference between a grizzly bear and a brown bear. I mean, typically inland bears that are brown bears, their range is quite extensive. I mean, very extensive. They cover huge areas over the course of a year. Whereas when you look at the coastal bears and the grizzlies, they get more sizable because they have more of a fish diet. And it's interesting because Billy Moles will tell you that for those who have actually eaten bear meat, inland bears you can eat. You don't even try to eat coastal bears because actually, he says, when we shoot large 10-foot grizzlies that weigh 1,200 pounds on the coast, as they're caping them out, it just smells like rancid fish oil. I mean, you can just smell it in their fat. And, you know, whatever you eat is going to taste like whatever it eats. You hear that often when you talk about wild game. So, you know, but again, getting back to the range thing, an inland bear covers way more distance and range than a bear just 150 miles away. That's
our Vermonter. Our Vermonter asked what ski resort, and I'll just say that it was the one that was on Bird Mountain.
Is that north of Sugarloaf?
I have no idea where Sugarloaf is.
Oh.
You know, I do a little work on, you know, the probably the furthest east I've been in Vermont is probably Chittenden, because there was a big bunch of sightings in Chittenden over the years.
I find it interesting how many encounters, Sasquatch encounters, are related to areas that are adjacent to, maybe not necessarily on top of, but adjacent to ski resorts. In New Hampshire, northern New Hampshire, near Bethlehem, New Hampshire, is Bretton Woods Ski Resort. Not far from there is Cannon Mountain Ski Resort.
Oh, yeah, Cannon Mountain.
Both of those areas have had encounters, like 3 or 4 encounters over the last decade, Class A encounters by both of those areas. And yet, when you look at other areas around there, there really isn't that much. Now,
well, Canaan, I know so much. Canaan is actually very close to the Berkshires.
Yeah.
And there has been a lot, like October Mountain. There's been sighting reports, the Quabbin. There's been
the interesting thing about Bretton Woods is that it's very close to the Mount Washington Hotel, and Mount Washington is very high mountain for that range. It's where the highest wind speed has been recorded and all. I mean, it's really pretty, it's funny because you'll go into those areas of around Bretton Woods, like the Bridal Falls area and stuff, and think, wow, there's a lot of people. I mean, you go in there on a typical Saturday, you see people moving around, and yet you get 15 or 20 miles further back on the back side of that pass, and you won't see anybody. I mean, you could sit there for 7 days and you don't see a snowmobile in the winter. You don't see, people just aren't getting back into some of those areas. So
Mike Ann just popped in to say hello, and yeah, him and I have had more than one time have rocks thrown at us. I don't know, when we get together, they like to throw rocks at us for whatever reason.
Rock magnet. Yeah. Well, I tell you, it's been an interesting discussion. I like a lot of and this, I see this a lot with my chat. I'm blessed with the people who choose to spend their Monday nights with us, because so many intriguing questions really come out of the chat, it seems like. Yep. And they're thoughtful questions. They're asking questions that they're following the conversation, and it leads them to consider something that maybe we aren't talking about, and they ask about it. And it's not like it happens now and then. I mean, it seems like it happens, a dozen times every time I do a show. So I really appreciate the interactive nature that our chat brings to the show. Like Leon said, if everybody's just going to show up and listen to us two primates talk about primate behavior, it probably wouldn't have been a great show. We were blessed by all the questions.
Really good questions. Yep.
But no, I appreciate you, Steve. It's always fun having you on the show.
Always fun.
I am really amped up and looking forward to what may unfold over the next, it won't be this Sunday, but because making time to prepare for it. But, she said she's going to have to drink for a week straight just to get ready for that show.
I told her today that it's like going to be preparing for an exorcism.
Well, it's going to be intriguing. It's going to be intriguing. And quite honestly, despite all of the drama, despite all of that, I believe that it is a learning moment. And we may not be learning stuff we're comfortable learning, but understanding why somebody chooses to do something that we could never see ourselves putting our place in doing. We wouldn't even consider it. But this person did. And it's like a mystery to me as to why, when you can delve into somebody, if they're willing to be honest and answer the questions truthfully, which
We have
whether or not
we have about a 60-40 chance there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, whether or not you believe he seems to try to be, Rick Dyer seems to try to be presenting this idea that, look, I don't care to such a degree that you can ask me what you want and I'll answer it. I really don't care anymore. And we saw some of that displayed in the way he answered some questions, but yet it still felt like we weren't getting all the answers we wanted, right? That's why I think this part 2 is probably a good idea. It's been a year since that show took place on Nikki's channel. I'm excited to see how it unfolds. I know if we can trust anybody to hold the accountability bar in place, it will be you. I think everybody in chat and everybody who watched the show last time trusts you with that task, but it will be a moment in which I don't think it's hard to deny that there is a problem in the community with a elevated threshold of gullibility. We see these large groups on Facebook. A lot of people seem to be easily subscribing to theories with little reason to do so. Whether that be pictures, whether that be evidence, blurriness, or whatever. It's like everybody who brings anything forward deserves a ribbon. Everybody's a winner. Everybody gets congratulated. I think people who are serious about wanting to find answers and move the ball aren't tolerant to that. And understanding why somebody like Rick would maybe do something that he did, I think that is helpful to some of these people who are suffering from a high degree of gullibility. But
it is what it is. I think it'll be a very interesting conversation to see what because it's not even so much what happened in 2012 and 2008. I think it's more interesting to find out what's going through is coconut now. And there's a problem in every community you go to, whether it be the paranormal community, the ufology community, the Bigfoot community, the you see it. I mean, this is just life. You have people that
we aren't special. It isn't something that only exists.
Yeah, you will have people that will believe everything. And then a certain amount of people, when you bring them the truth, will go, "Oh crap, I thought that was real." Well, okay, back to the drawing board. And then you have a certain percentage of those people that you show them the evidence, and they want to believe what they want to believe, and they will, ignore the real evidence in favor of their own belief system. And hey, I get that. Dyer has talked about the Patterson-Gimlin film being a hoax. That's his opinion, and he's entitled to it. As long as he's not hoaxing, he's entitled to his opinions. And it's going to be kind of interesting to see those opinions. And I'm not out to change the opinion. I'm just out to make sure that, if he says anything as fact, that it is indeed fact. And that's, the big thing, the reason why I will be there. And I may have some questions for him too, because I'm very curious about certain things.
You bring up an interesting point that this isn't the only community that this type of thing exists in. But, here's the thing. When we're talking about something that we approach in most part as being flesh and blood, I know there's a lot that don't look at it that way, but I think most of us do. When we talk about other areas of the paranormal, like ghosts, right? There's been so many accounts, so many stories told, so many experiences shared, that quite honestly, if you're not a believer in it, until you find yourself in a room hearing voices that you don't attribute to a source, you'll probably never be a believer in it. I mean, there is no concrete threshold that's going to tip you over other than a personal experience. When you start talking about Sasquatch, whether or not it's real or not, or the proof required to show the world that it's real or not, I think we believe that exists in a solid form out there. And when you have somebody like Rick who manipulated that process, that's a harder foul than what you see committed in other areas of the paranormal, so to speak. And I think that's why people take it so personally and they react so, emotionally to
It's
it.
a visceral reaction.
Yeah, yeah. So
And
I'm excited to see where that goes.
nobody knows that better than I do.
Yeah. Well, you've investigated enough. You have delved chin deep into enough hoaxes, dissected the psychology, the motive, all of that behind so many, that I think you are to a point to where when you start looking at something unfold in front of you, the way you see it is completely different than the way most of us see it. The things you're looking at, the things you're paying attention to are different than what most of us are.
And
so I think when we see you in a conversation with a Rick Dyer, it's an opportunity for us to see that employed, so to speak.
And the other thing too is a lot of people haven't had necessarily the experience that I've had. For example, was everything done perfectly by me in 2008? No. Problem is number one was never get too close to an investigation where you're kind of not being able to say what you need to say. And I had to hold my words for a few days.
Yeah.
And that caused a lot of people to get angry with me. But then again, they wanted me to convict somebody too of this without having the evidence in front of me to do that. And I won't do that. That's not the way investigations work. You don't call somebody guilty of a crime. They may be your number one primate suspect, but you still have to have the evidence before you're able to open your mouth and say, hey, this is X, Y, and Z.
I think that's a tendency that's displayed in our community a lot. And we're not just talking about hoaxes. Anytime somebody says, well, look at Randy and Shane. They've got Scott Nelson is in possession of a lengthy audio recording that he's phonetically comparing to the Sirius sounds and breaking it down into a way that we can all watch it be presented and understand it. Okay. Right. And it takes time. But yet, once you hear they've got this, it's like, I want it now. I want it now. Come on. Right.
And if anything, if I was to be critical of anything, I would have not even made mention that you had those until everything was done with them. But then again, some of the stuff that's going on is because they put it out there a little bit.
Here's the thing.
So it's kind of like
it was a timing issue. When they captured that audio recording, understanding that this is coming on the feet of them over 4 years, having 8 different trackways that they've casted, they collected it on a Thursday night. It occurred. They captured this lengthy recording. They were speaking at an event on Saturday. They go to the event. They're speaking at the event on Saturday. They just captured this. I mean, they are, they're high on the idea, wow, look what we've got in this box here, right? They played it at that event. Scott Nelson was speaking at that event. He was out in the lobby at a vendor table, but his son was in the room when Randy and Shane were talking, and they played that. And his son started hearing it, and he ran out and got his dad. He said, Dad, you've got to come in and listen. So he comes in and listens to it. Scott gets with him, and the first thing Scott says is, I'm going to do what I'm going to do with this audio. And he's probably one of the most qualified people to do it. But the first thing he says is quit playing this for people.
Yeah.
At least wait until we can package it into something so that when they see it, they understand what they're hearing. They understand how it does compare, or how it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't.
And that's what I like about this is that they stopped playing it for people, and now they're doing their due diligence. And that's an awesome thing. I mean, that's people don't understand.
And they weren't too proud to not follow it. When Scott Nelson said, "Whoa, slow your roll," they slowed it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of egos out there that would have said, "Screw you! We're the ones with the evidence. We're going to do what
here's the funny thing, Jeff, is that a lot of people think that when I put stuff out there that I've it's like I've heard people do their drive-bys on certain pieces of evidence I put out there over the years that come from other sources they think that I've done some sort of drive-by on it themselves,
Mhm.
and it's not. It's every investigation I do is, a couple, like, there one piece of evidence was, 4 months before, 5 months before I put it out there,
Yeah.
because we were doing stuff behind the scenes. And then when we feel comfortable, we all get together and talk about the pros and cons, and move forward with it. And the same thing with the video that had come out, years before. It took months of, okay, we're going to do this the proper way and put this out. Not today, not tomorrow, not next month. We're going to get all our ducks in a row. We're going to do the analysis. We're going to, and that thing, I spent 400 hours basically
Yeah.
looking at this thing frame by frame by frame by frame.
And I
So
think
and I am a pragmatist when it comes to investigation. So if somebody thinks somebody is hoaxing, unless there's a quick, well, like for example, the Mississippi Bigfoot thing, when I found out that Josh Highcliffe was a character, that's the only source. And he was in the IMDb as a character, and it was played by an actor in this, this Mountain Monsters wannabe show that
Mhm.
was, based out of Louisiana. And they have the actor's face blocked out. Well, we're talking here with Josh Highcliffe, and it's not even Josh Highcliffe. So, number one, the documentary or this TV series is not real. So you learn that, but you also learn that this video everybody's looking at was actually a bait by this TV show to put out there to get interest into their TV show.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's all it was. And, when that was found out relatively quickly, then you can put it out there. But there's other things, like legitimate people coming up with stuff saying, hey, what do you think? Then you got to sit back and look at it and analyze and go over it.
Yeah. And
So,
Pat brings up a good point. Pat just mentioned in the chat, once it's released, it's going to be analyzed by so many others. I think that's one of the reasons why I think people are starting to see the value in tiered vetting. We see Doug Hychek employing that in the preparation of the Legend Meets Science 2 documentary.
but
It isn't good enough to just put something into one lab.
But
it isn't good enough
right.
to have a soundbite analyzed
Great.
by Texas A&M's bioacoustic lab. Let's get North Carolina's lab to do it too. Let's do it in triplicate, so that if we've learned anything from like past DNA projects, without naming a whole lot of names, one bad apple in the group ruins the whole collective effort.
Especially if it's the main scientist.
Yeah. So you could put it into, let's say, a DNA lab. You put DNA samples into a DNA lab, and you find out you've got a problem with the integrity of that lab. Well, if you put it in 3 different labs and they're independently separate from each other, all doing the same vetting, that shouldn't be an issue. You have 2 other levels to vet. And Scott Nelson phonetically dissecting it or deciphering it is one thing. Having a bioacoustics lab listen to it and say the audio capture itself, despite what you're looking at is on the audio, the recording itself, the ambient sound that's in the recording. This is a different area this is recorded in than the ambient sound that you hear in the Sierra sounds. So let's eliminate this idea that maybe you're bringing 15 more minutes of recordings that were found in a drawer from the Sierra. You know what I mean? I mean, you do so much by tiering your vetting rather than just having one source say, I'll put my stamp on it, go release it to the world,
And that there's a couple of things. I mean, yeah, once it's released, other people will analyze it, but their analysis is a lot of times, depending on who's doing it. Like for example, it depends on the source. Like when I put something out there, I've been to the sites. I have measured, called, investigated left, right, up, down, and I'm looking at all aspects. I'm looking at the story. I'm looking at the psychology behind the story. I'm looking at, does the story make sense? I am looking at verifying the story. I am looking at timelines. I am looking at the video or the piece of, evidence that's in front of me myself. But you have these people that will analyze it by just looking at the video or looking at that. And hey, have there been sightings around that area? Well, I don't know. Well, then how can you call what you're doing as an analysis?
Yeah.
You're not, you need to have if you're going to conduct an independent analysis, then do it the right way. But so many people will take one aspect, and an aspect of any piece of evidence is multifaceted, and they all have to be credible. And
Yeah.
if one thing is not credible, it kills the rest. So
A
that's,
good
yeah,
example of that, Pat Turner himself was asked to come on a show. It was kind of the role of the skeptic. He knew the show's host. He's friends with him. And they had somebody that was presenting a short video clip, and said they wanted Pat to give his thoughts based on just that clip. It was a 30-second clip. Now, they admitted it to Pat that there's a whole backstory here. They went out and took measurements so that they knew how high this thing was, and they measured that tree, and they did check this and check that. And then they tell Pat, now watch this little clip and tell us what you think. Pat watches the clip and says, I think it's inconclusive. And they're like, what? And he says, listen,
right.
I haven't been to that area like you were. You're asking me to take your word for it. I didn't measure how
Right.
tall the tree was.
And that's why
I haven't heard all of your backstory. Right. If you're just going to show me a 30-second clip and say, give you my opinion is this is inconclusive. Now, I may feel differently once I go there myself and do all that stuff, but based on the clip, I can't give you anything.
And I agree with Pat 100%, because you can't analyze your own evidence. You have to pass that off to a third party that has no investment into it. And that's, the evidence, a lot of the evidences that I put out there, that have been given to me, that's what I do. If something's bullshit, I'll call it, pardon my French, but I will call it that.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom, or something is inconclusive, or something is.
I think more often than not,
but Pat's right.
We are asked to look at something that you can't.
And I don't blame you, Pat.
any other conclusion than that something is inconclusive. I don't know your backstory. I haven't been to the site. Now, if I go to the site and I look over and there's 3 campsites that are 150 yards away, and there's a parking lot for another park over here for 50 vehicles, and you're telling me this, the ability to this be conclusive just took a notch back for me once I've analyzed that. If we go out there and it's completely remote, and you tell me your whole backstory, and I measure that tree, and I'm looking at it from that shot point that you took the video, I may feel completely different about it. But there's so many things that we look at and we're asked to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on without having enough data to even accurately make the judgment. You're the bad guy because you put it up or down. And yet the truth is, we should have just said, I'm not even going to give you my opinion. There's not enough data to process to give you an accurate opinion here. But I felt bad in the fact that, Pat was kind of made out to be the bad guy that night. He was just being brutally honest. You don't have enough data here for me to give you anything other than I don't see what you're seeing. But what you're seeing is based on the story behind it. And you stood there and all this. I didn't, But
that's why a third party is so important. If I was to get something, I would be like, all right, you know what? Okay. If people want to come in, and that's why I've never, ever denied anybody to say, as far as, like the foot castings, hey, you know what? I show it to Dr. Jeff Meldrum. I showed it to Cliff Berryman. I showed it to whoever wanted to look at it. What do you think? Right. I showed it. Very first person I showed that, asking for analysis was Dr. John Bindernagel.
Uh-huh.
So, it's very important to get that feedback.
Well, and people need to understand what kind of feedback somebody's able to give them. If you sent a casting to Dr. Meldrum and he wasn't there to see the trackway you casted it from, or if it was even a trackway or one lone track, he doesn't get all that. He just gets to open up the box and here's the track you casted.
But he is such a in this case, he is an expert on foot.
I agree with that. Yeah. But the best you'll get from him a lot of times would be, I see signs, I see the dermal ridges, I see all the things that I would typically want to find to authenticate something. And here's what I'm going to tell you. This track does not appear to be man-made. And that may be the best attaboy that he can give you right there. Because to get him to say, well, this was definitely laid by a Sasquatch, that's not verbiage he's going to use. He's going to say, I don't see any reason to believe this was made by man. I see all the things that I look for when trying to decide if something's authentic. That is a win. But a lot of people will hear that and say, well, that's not enough for me.
Right.
You know?
And I guess Steven Stetzer in the off of Facebook in the chat, I'd rather be told not enough info to prove it to me rather than the novel response, it's fake. And I agree. There's too many flybys saying, oh, that's fake. That's fake. That's fake. It's the same reasoning. You got to have evidence to say it's fake, or you got to have some credible backing, not just it's fake. To me, that's a cop out. That's a drive-by. It's the same as somebody saying, "Oh wow, look at that Bigfoot," with the blob squatch in it with the red circle around. It's the same type of drive-by.
And this isn't hard to identify online, Steve. Right. I listen to your shows, and almost every time when you say I disagree, you follow up for the reason why. Let me tell you why I don't believe that's the case. I try to do that here. I try when I say I don't agree with that. Let me explain why. Or I may preface something that I'm about to say by saying, I can't present this as fact, and let me explain why. Because I don't want to paint myself into a corner where somebody's going to say, well, you said this. No, a lot of times people hear what you don't say.
No, I'm not that much of a wuss. I will tell people, hey, this is what I believe. Right.
Yeah.
But I have my reasons for believing it. Yeah. Now you may disagree with me, but that doesn't, because I have my reasons doesn't make me a flyby. Just say it's real. Well, why? Well, look at it. No, because I've done an investigation behind it. I've talked to the witnesses. I've measured. I've recreated. I've done all this stuff. And this is the reason why I believe that it's tending to be the real thing rather than something else. And at least I have my reasonings behind it. So therefore, anybody that disagrees with me, well, we can debate it, but that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion. I'm entitled to mine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's probably time to land this plane. And like I say, I appreciate you being on the show. I appreciate every time you come on because I love the conversation where it goes. One of the most genuine, insightful people that I tend to have these conversations with. And that's why I use you as a sounding board. A lot of times when I have something I'm looking at, I have to send you a messenger and say, dude, are you available right now? Because
True.
If I don't know what I'm looking at, or I don't have the threshold of experience enough, a lot of this in our community is, and I'm very quick to admit this, I don't have that historical reference of a lot of things. What people were doing in this community 10 years ago, 12 years ago, this guy did this guy said that. I'm not versed like you are, or Nikki is. And so a lot of times I'll call you up and say, what can you tell me about this guy? Or what can you tell me about this situation?
Not many people can say this, and this is not being braggadocious, but it just goes to, what I've experienced as far as having eyes on me and asking questions and stuff like that. I did a podcast once. And unfortunately I wasn't able to, get everything out that I wanted to get out, but I got the basis of information out. And that podcast had 31,000 live listeners.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've had all eyes on me across the world at one point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very eye-opening. So, when it comes to stuff, I pretty much now very well am seasoned to handle it.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Steve. I appreciate you. If you want to hang out backstage just for a moment, I'll talk to you a little bit after the show here. So, want to thank everyone in chat for choosing Monday night to spend with us once again. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. I think you'll really enjoy next week's show also. Like I say, we're going to have Seth Breedlove and we're going to have Alex Petikoff on talking about their documentary, answering questions you may have about the documentary. I had questions when I watched it. What happened later on that night? What happened? They'll be here to answer some of those candid questions. They'll be here to maybe even give us a little sneak peek into part 2 without, disclosing anything too revealing. But I'm excited for him to be here. Should be a great show. Should be a great conversation. You guys, I want you all to be safe this week. Take it easy. Know that you're appreciated here when you show up. On your way out the door, if you'd give us a like, and if it's your first time here, go ahead and subscribe. I would thank you in advance for that too. You guys have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next Monday.